the summer of 2000, the leaders of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization came to America at the invitation of US President Bill Clinton. There were hopes of a resolution to a conflict which had lasted decades and killed thousands. But 2 weeks of negotiations broke up without agreement. Each side blamed the other, and the war of words soon escalated into more violence on Israel's borders. They called it the Second Intifada, the Second Uprising. The surge in fighting lasted more than 4 years. It was another bleak chapter in a conflict which has defied resolution for generations.
We have this cycle of violence which seems to me absolutely impossible to break.
It's been an aerial war, an intelligence war, a war of spies, and a war of soldiers. And that war has gone on consistently now for over 10 years.
The roots of the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians go deep. With each passing year, they seem to grow more entangled.
There's often a misconception that the conflict is essentially the result of cultural predispositions between two conflicting religions and two conflicting cultures. And that's just simply not true.
You have extremists on both sides who feed off hatred.
How did this bitter conflict begin? Were there opportunities to end the war that were missed? And how can peace be achieved when there is such implacable hatred and grievance on both sides? The British had been in Palestine for almost 3 decades. They had come in the aftermath of the First World War. They were leaving in the aftermath of the Second. Their administration had been a tumultuous one. In the 1920s and 1930s, thousands of Jews had emigrated to Palestine. There were violent clashes with the local Arab population. The British authorities were caught in between. Their attempts to limit further immigration enraged the Jews. Their earlier support for a Jewish homeland enraged the Arabs. And the pressures only grew. 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust. Survivors had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. Many saw no future for themselves in Europe. Thousands tried to move to the Jews' historic homeland in the Middle East.
After the Second World War, it was clear to Britain, bankrupt as it was, that it would have to withdraw.
By 1947, the British had realized that the current status quo was completely unsustainable. It was no longer able to come up with a solution or even contain the conflict that was going on at the time between the two communities.
The future of Palestine was instead put in the hands of the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, a plan for the partition of Palestine was agreed. The news was met with jubilation among Jews and fury among Arabs. Violence broke out between the communities as British troops withdrew. At midnight on the 14th of May, 1948, the British Mandate of Palestine came to an end. The State of Israel was born. It was attacked immediately. Forces from Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt secured Arab territories in Palestine and launched military offensives against the new Jewish state.
They fought off 6 Arab armies with improvised weapons to establish and defend their territory. And they ended up with 2 slivers of territory which drove into Palestinian lands. A lot of Palestinians, some left voluntarily, some left because they were frightened, but most were driven out of their territories to create the Palestinian problem of a peoples in the Middle East.
Israel may have triumphed, but the fledgling state was still surrounded and outnumbered by enemies bent on its destruction. The violence which surrounded the country's birth would continue. The Six-Day War of 1967 saw Israel seize territory from Jordan and Syria and sweep across the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula.
And that was a war in which the Arab nations clearly were about to attack Israel. Israel had, as it were, both a legal and moral right to strike first, and they did strike first.
So you ended up having the West Bank and Gaza, which after 1948, you had the West Bank that was part of Jordan and the Gaza Strip that was then part of Egypt come under direct Israeli control.
Israel's neighbors struck back in 1973. A surprise attack on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur began another round of violence.
They put Israel under great pressure. Israel responded. It was a pretty close thing, actually, and they ended up back where they started from, but it had shocked the Israelis. The 73 war showed the Israelis really how vulnerable they were, and it changed their thinking.
The fighting led Egypt and Israel to the negotiating table. The Camp David Accords of 1978 returned the Sinai to Egypt. But Israel kept East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. And it was not just land the Israelis had acquired. Over 1 million Palestinian Arabs lived in the occupied territories. It was the start of another long and bloody struggle, and a very different kind of war. On one side were the increasingly powerful Israeli armed forces. On the other were the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO targeted Israeli soldiers and civilians alike. They attacked buses, hotels, and schools. The Israelis responded with raids on PLO camps abroad, with assassinations of leading militants, and with more and more settlements on occupied Palestinian land.
We had been kicked out from our homeland. 60% of our people became refugees, homeless, stateless.
The war seemed intractable. But in the early 1990s, secret peace talks began.
What distinguished Oslo from other peace agreements and its success was that Oslo, again, was an immediate and desperate response from both the Palestinian and Israeli leadership in response to the First Intifada, which really proved to both that the current status quo was completely unsustainable.
And it is based on a two-state solution, so that there shall be an Israeli state guaranteed that the Arab neighbors of Israel should give up all of their rhetoric that they want to destroy Israel and must be seen to do so and guarantee Israel's security. In return for that, the Palestinians shall have an independent state, not just an autonomous territory, but an independent state. And Jerusalem shall be a free city.
The talks led to the Oslo Accords and the establishment of a Palestinian Authority. This promised an elected government for Palestinians in parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
So the Palestinian Authority were an interim self-governing authority created through the Oslo Accords. And they were essentially tasked with social welfare provision and security provision in the occupied Palestinian territories.
The assumption was we would move hesitatingly towards the realization of the Oslo Accords. The reality has been different.
After the failure of the Camp David summit in 2000, violence flared once again, and the hopes of peace were soon to take another blow. In 2006, the hardline Islamist group Hamas won elections in Palestine. In their founding charter was a commitment to the total destruction of the Israeli state. In the early 2000s, violence erupted once again between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Efforts to end their long-running conflict had ground to a halt. The fighting that followed lasted more than 4 years. Thousands died. This is a conflict driven by old disputes and unresolved grievances, where each side blames the other.
It's our country, it's our holy place, it's not to the Jewish people.
If we, the Jews, don't believe that this land is ours, so the world's gonna believe it's ours? Let's go back to 47.
By January 2006, the violence of the Second Intifada had eased at last. Elections were held in the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The poll was overdue. Voting had been delayed by a dispute over the electoral system and by fears over who would win. Under the control of the Fatah party, the Palestinian Authority had become a byword for incompetence and corruption. Fatah's leaders could agree on almost nothing, and the people had noticed. Fatah's political dominance was threatened by the rise of another party, Hamas.
We can probably conceptualize Hamas as being the armed wing of the Palestinian strand of the Muslim Brotherhood, as they were created specifically for that reason in 1987. Hamas managed to essentially transform itself from being a marginalized political, social, and military organization into a deeply embedded and sophisticated part of Palestinian politics.
Hamas is pretty anti-Semitic. They say that you simply cannot trust the Jews, you cannot trust the Israelis, and Hamas represents a rejection both of the peace process and of the Palestinian Authority.
I can understand the Israeli perspective. If Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map, which they say they do, then Hamas cannot be included in any sort of peace dialogue that there should be.
Israel, the United States, and the European Union had all declared Hamas a terrorist organization. But that did not dent its popularity in Palestine. When the elections finally came, the results stunned the world.
It was a protest vote. It was a protest against the crippling humanitarian conditions. It was a protest against the ongoing Israeli occupation. It was a protest against the rampant corruption from Fatah and the Palestinian Authority.
The problem for the outside world with Hamas is that Hamas has many, many deficiencies, but lack of popular legitimacy is not among them. And so anyone who condemns Hamas as merely a terrorist group has got to take on board the idea that 1.5 million people in Gaza seem to back it.
The election plunged the Palestinian Authority into crisis. Tensions between Hamas and Fatah grew as they squabbled over control of the security forces.
So immediately after the elections, Hamas sought to create a unity government with Fatah. Negotiations have broken down and Fatah outright refused. The US intelligence services had directly armed them to then go ahead and carry out a military coup against Hamas. But before that plan could get underway, Hamas intelligence had kind of intercepted the plan, and they had therefore preemptively taken over the Gaza Strip before that could happen. And that's what essentially led to Hamas's takeover and setting up of a de facto government in Gaza.
In June 2007, the Palestinian Authority was split in two. In the West Bank, Fatah retained control. But in Gaza, Hamas tightened its grip. Thousands have fled there after the founding of Israel in 1948. More than half a century on, the Gaza Strip has become one of the most densely populated places on the planet. Life for civilians in Gaza was not easy even before Hamas seized control in 2007. After the takeover, things got worse, much worse.
The Israeli attempt was to squeeze Gaza. As long as you have Hamas as your leaders, then you will suffer. They blockaded Gaza. They prevented Gaza from receiving anything they didn't want them to receive, foods and medicines and building materials.
So, for example, there was a ban on things like pasta, chocolate, school textbooks, school chemistry textbooks. You know, it was very, very arbitrary. Pretty much everything was banned, even lentils.
In response to the blockade, Hamas militants bombarded Israel with hundreds of rockets. Israel retaliated with mortar and airstrikes. In 2008, Egypt managed to broker a ceasefire. The rocket attacks from Hamas were to stop. Israel would halt the airstrikes. And as part of the agreement, the longer the truce held, the more open the borders would become. The lull offered respite to civilians on both sides. Goods began to flow again. But it lasted just 6 months. The ceasefire collapsed in December 2008. Yet again, each side blamed the other.
سامحهمش لأن هم أعداء هم دمر حياتنا.
Israel launched Operation Cast Lead. F-16 fighter jets and Apache helicopters led the attack. In the first 4 minutes of the operation, 100 targets were hit. For 22 days afterwards, the Israelis continued to pound Gaza. A ground offensive began, and soldiers penetrated deep into Gaza City. The Israelis said their strikes were pinpoint attacks on Hamas targets. But in such a densely populated area, civilian casualties were inevitable.
In no way, shape or form is revenge a legal strategic option, certainly not under the Geneva Convention. So it was in my view, it was an excessive overuse of force by the Israeli military.
Part of this is the fact that the Israelis are not as good at dialing up and dialing down their reactions as they would like us to believe. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are only 65,000 professionals, or more than 100,000 conscripts who are not necessarily so well trained.
By mid-January, up to 1,400 Gazans had been killed. Among them, 313 children. In the face of growing international condemnation, Israel ended the operation on the 18th of January, 2009.
The only problem the Israelis have when they do intervene in Gaza is it creates terrible headlines around the world because their action always seems disproportionate.
If anything, it spurred Hamas's popularity, not only in Gaza but also in the West Bank, where you saw demonstrations come out in support of Gaza. And then that was then met by not only Israeli retaliation, but also the Palestinian Authority clamping down on demonstrators.
Among the targets of the Israeli offensive were a network of tunnels. Thousands of Gazans worked on them. Some tunnels were defensive, used to store weapons or offer shelter for Hamas officials. Other tunnels were for attack, to deliver fighters across the fence to Israel. And some were used to cross the border with Egypt, bypassing the economic blockade.
The tunnels have provided one of the very few means that they have to access the very essential things that they need to survive.
The Israelis have invaded Gaza. They've tried to block the tunnels. They've bombed them. They have tried to locate the tunnels. They've done quite a lot, but they could never stop them being used.
For a time in 2012, Hamas had a friend across the border in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood held power in Cairo. Hamas were their allies, and goods flowed across the border into the Gaza Strip. In 2013, however, the Muslim Brotherhood were overthrown in a coup. The new military government of Egypt was far less friendly to their neighbors in Gaza.
When Morsi fell, the Sisi government in Egypt, very right-wing, very military authoritarian government, have done more to try to block the tunnels. They've flooded them, they've put poison gas in them, they've put sewage in them. They've done all that they can to try to make these tunnels impassable.
The underground network joining Gaza to the outside world was systematically picked apart. By 2014, Hamas was in a financial crisis. Without the flow of smuggled goods to tax, the income of the government collapsed. Almost half the adult Gazan population were unemployed. Millions had little access to clean water. Power shortages were widespread. The United Nations declared a humanitarian emergency. Despite the suffering in Gaza, Hamas remained popular. Their defiance was attractive. Many Gazans blamed Israel or the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for their troubles instead. While there remained a fight for the hearts of Palestinians, Hamas had an interest in prolonging the conflict with Israel. Politics can perpetuate violence and a siege mentality. And this is no less true of the other side in this war. In Israel, as in Gaza, a hardline approach can be a vote-winning one. The 8th of May, 1972. Sabina Flight 571 had just left Vienna when 4 armed Palestinian terrorists entered the cockpit. They ordered the pilot to land at Lod, the largest airport in Israel. The terrorists, 2 men and 2 women, then demanded the release of more than 300 Palestinians imprisoned in Israel. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Golda Meir, began negotiations. As the hours ticked by, the hijackers allowed a group of white-clad technicians to approach the plane. There was a problem with the hydraulics. If the Boeing 707 was to take off again, it would have to be fixed. But the men in white were not mechanics. They were soldiers from the elite Sayeret Matkal unit of Israel's special forces.
When it comes to the Israeli combating of terrorism, it's safe to say that they take a hard power approach.
That was unusual, but special forces are noted for going to the extreme, if necessary, of doing remarkable things. They don't normally have to, but what's special about them is that if they ever need to, they will.
They are extremely well trained and they are technically brilliant. They are right up there with the best of us in the West.
The disguised Israeli commandos stormed the hijacked plane. It was over in minutes. The 2 male terrorists were killed. The 2 women were captured. A hostage was fatally wounded, and 1 commando was shot in the arm. He was a young soldier, nearing the end of his time in the military. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu would go on to become one of the most successful politicians in Israeli history. He would be prime minister longer than the country's founding father, David Ben-Gurion. And he, more than anyone else, would shape the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the early 21st century.
What we want to see here is a new beginning. The terror is the old world. It's the old fighting. It's the old recalcitrance. What we would like to see is a break with the past and a beginning of a new future for peace with the Palestinian Arabs, with the Arab states.
After serving as Israeli ambassador to the UN during the 1980s, Netanyahu returned home and began a remarkable political rise. In 1993, he was elected leader of the right-wing Likud party. A coalition of nationalists, Likud had broken the domination of the left in the 1970s and remade Israel's political landscape. In 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was the party's candidate for prime minister. He narrowly won the election, but his first term in office would be short. As part of the peace process, in 1998, Israel ceded territory in the West Bank to Palestine. Netanyahu's right-wing allies were outraged. His ruling coalition collapsed. An election followed, which Netanyahu lost. But he did not give up on his political career. 10 years later, he became prime minister once again. This time, Netanyahu would not be risking his future on compromises with the Palestinians. After the 2008 Israeli incursion into Gaza, an uneasy and unofficial truce had held. There were still Hamas rockets and secret Israeli raids. People were still dying. But a full-scale war had been avoided. Until 2012. It began with a drone strike. The targeted assassination of Hamas leader Ahmed Jabari. Jabari was the man blamed by Israel for masterminding the rocket attacks on their civilians.
Drones and special forces are the spearhead of the Israeli military. In fact, in drones, they were one of the leading pioneers, if not the pioneer. They created some of the first weaponized drone systems. And as a result, they're one of the most advanced drone actors in the world.
So they say, look, we're in this existential war for our survival. It will go on as long as we can foresee, and we have to fight this war in all ways possible.
In the days that followed, more strikes hit positions all over the Gaza Strip. They targeted Hamas headquarters and munition stores, as well as civilian infrastructure. Hamas responded with a surge of Katyusha rocket fire. These were indiscriminate attacks, targeting cities and civilians.
Did the rockets being fired by Hamas come before the airstrikes and the penetration and the assassinations by the Israelis, or did the Israelis come first?
Many of the rockets were intercepted by the latest innovation from Israel's world-leading defense industry. The Iron Dome missile shield was the most advanced air defense system ever deployed. And this was its biggest test yet. The number of missiles shot down is disputed. But in the week-long conflict, just 6 Israelis were killed by Hamas rockets. Israel's military superiority had guaranteed victory. The Israeli public overwhelmingly backed their prime minister. But some could not help noting that Operation Pillar of Defense had come just weeks before parliamentary elections. Despite losing seats, Likud remained the largest party. Benjamin Netanyahu stayed on as prime minister. He began his third term facing an old question. How could the conflict with the Palestinians be resolved? At the urging of the Americans, peace talks resumed, but they soon ran into trouble. The disputed settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank continued to expand. In April 2014, the peace talks collapsed.
Sadly, in my view, with the right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu, there is clearly no effort to resurrect the two-state solution.
How can you create a state when you have villages effectively cut off from each other, being separated by settlements, walls and checkpoints?
It certainly suits Israeli purposes at the political level. There are those who would argue that it is to an Israeli government advantage to continue the conflict.
Peace was apparently impossible. Tipping back into open conflict would prove all too easy. In June 2014, 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and murdered in the West Bank. A massive operation was launched to find those responsible. 350 Palestinians were arrested, including leading Hamas officials. Tensions rose quickly. A Palestinian youth was killed by a gang of Israeli nationalists. Rockets were fired from Gaza. Then, on the 8th of July, Israel began Operation Protective Edge. Once again, the Gaza Strip became a war zone.
It was actually, at this point, Hamas was very much trying to avoid a military confrontation with Israel, because after the 2 previous confrontations, it could not afford to go into another war with Israel.
What happened then was absolutely horrific in terms of the amount of force that was actually used.
They used their air power assets, their F-16s and their drones. And one of the most controversial ways in which the Israelis seek to counter terrorism is through the knock-on roof tactic. And this is where they send in a dud missile, which hits the top of the roof, doesn't really do any damage, but it's a warning. And it's a potent warning of an imminent threat, because within the next 15 minutes, that home is going to be destroyed.
International attempts to secure a ceasefire faltered. On the 17th of July 2014, a ground offensive was launched. By the end of the 7-week operation, 20,000 homes in Gaza had been destroyed. More than 2,000 Palestinians had been killed.
And again, it proved incredibly detrimental to the organization, and not only to Hamas, but also to Gaza as a whole, because this time it really did effectively destroy the Strip.
The thing is that Israel has all of the cards here. Israel surrounds Gaza. It has the ability to completely cut it off from the outside world.
Elections were soon due in Israel once again. Netanyahu had been in power for 6 years, and a close race was predicted. Netanyahu called for a nationality bill, which would define Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, and the Jewish people alone. And he confirmed no Palestinian state would come into being during his next term. The remarks were often controversial, criticized at home and abroad. but they seemed to work. Netanyahu won a fourth term as prime minister. But Likud had cannibalized the support of previous allies in government. To form a new administration, they would have to rely on nationalist parties, even more hostile to the peace process. Benjamin Netanyahu was nearing the 10-year anniversary of his second stint in power, but his political dominance was waning. Police began an investigation into possible corruption, and the UN passed a motion condemning the ongoing construction of settlements on occupied lands. But if Netanyahu was weakened domestically, he soon acquired a powerful new ally on the international scene. Relations with the US administration of Barack Obama had become difficult. There was exasperation in the White House about the Israeli Prime Minister's attitude to the peace process. But Obama's time in office was coming to an end. A presidential election was due, and a political bombshell was about to go off. In November 2016, Donald J. Trump won the US presidential election. The controversial Republican stunned the world with his unexpected triumph. It was a result which was welcomed by the government in Jerusalem. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had known Donald Trump for years. Now, his friend was in the White House. The new president promised change. He did not disappoint. He announced that the United States would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and relocate its embassy to the city. The move delighted many American supporters of Israel. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu hailed the announcement as well. But it was condemned by governments around the world. Even old American allies in Europe expressed their concern. They had their embassies in Tel Aviv and had no intention of moving them.
The move of the embassy to Jerusalem was largely met with significant protest on the Palestinian side. I mean, it was completely outrageous as far as Palestinians were concerned. It essentially violated, the terms of what they see to be a resolution to the conflict.
Protests soon scarred the West Bank and Gaza. In spring 2018, a campaign of weekly mass demonstrations began. They called it the Great March of Return.
What they're essentially demanding is two things. The first is the right to return to their ancestors' homes that were taken by Israel in 1948. And the second is to end this 12-year-long blockade that Gazans have been placed under and that the UN has openly proclaimed amounts to collective punishment.
The problem the Israelis always face when there is protest in Gaza, particularly peaceful protest or relatively peaceful protest, is that they act disproportionately. But also there's an element in Israeli defense thinking which is about punishment. And so to actually overreact is a way of convincing civilians in Gaza that the next time you think about these demonstrations, bear in mind that some people may die.
President Trump soon enraged the protesters again. In March 2019, just weeks before another Israeli general election, he welcomed Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House. The president announced that the United States would become the first country to endorse the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights.
The United States has backed the expansion of Israel by means of warfare. The role of the Trump administration in the Arab-Israeli conflict has been completely one-sided. And so the two-state solution, which is the only solution that the world has been able to see to this conflict since 1967, is now very unlikely to take place.
In January 2020, the Trump administration unveiled the final part of its long-awaited peace plan. It promised a Palestinian state, but gave Israel more land in return. And the plan was dependent on Hamas giving up power in Gaza. It was immediately rejected by the Palestinians. Trump came to office promising to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But a lasting peace seems as far away as ever. Hamas still holds sway in the Gaza Strip, more than a decade after seizing power. Their defiance towards Israel remains popular. Their dispute with rivals Fatah goes on. In Israel, 2 general elections in 2019 and a third in March 2020 have all failed to produce a stable government. Benjamin Netanyahu may have become the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, but his political future seems increasingly uncertain. More than 70 years have now passed since the founding of Israel. The decades have been stained by grief and bloodshed. But today, the once fragile new country thrives. A wealthy and powerful democracy. For the Palestinians, life, especially in the Gaza Strip, seems to grow ever more difficult with each passing year. There remains no sign of an end to the conflict.
The current Israeli government really doesn't want the two-state solution. They've more or less said that, not in so many words, but that's what they mean.
There is really no potential for this conflict dying down anytime soon or anytime in the near future. And that's primarily because at the moment now in Israel you have a right-wing government and a right-wing leader in Netanyahu who is adamant on militarizing this conflict. And the more radical elements are always going to end up finding political relevance in that kind of climate.
How can anybody deny the right of Israel to exist, but also of the Palestinians to exist? They both have an equal right to exist.
Any lasting peace will involve compromise. But compromise is unpopular. And in Palestine, Israel, and America, the demands of politics have too often triumphed over the needs of peace.